You're listening to Northwoods Church Matters, a podcast of Northwoods Church in Evansville, Indiana, where we discuss why the local church matters and things that matter to the local church. I'm your host, Matt Higgins. All right, welcome back to the Northwoods Church Matters podcast. I'm here with my bro, Nathan.
Hello.
And we're going to talk about anger today. As quoting my favorite TV show from when I was a child, you wouldn't like me when I'm angry.
Matt, I would like you anytime.
Oh, that's very sweet of you to say so. But I was obsessed with the Incredible Hulk when I was a kid. She-Hulk's got nothing on the original Bill Bixby Incredible Hulk and Lou Ferrigno.
Agreed.
Anyway, all right. But today we're continuing our Understanding Emotion series, and we're talking about anger today. So I'm excited about that.
Me too. So my first question for you, what is anger?
Well, I've got a good definition for you today. So the book that I'm actually going to recommend this week is a book by David Powlison, who's a biblical counselor, recently passed away, but he's got a good book on anger called Good and Angry. It's a book that I go through with persons that come in with issues with anger. Powlison's definition of anger is an active displeasure towards something that's important enough to care about. So anger really is like this moral judgment that we're making. Anger at its core essence says, that's not right. And so there's an essence of justice that's there, or fairness. Like this feeling of that's not fair, or that's not right, or that's not just. So for anger to occur, there's got to be a standard and then a violation of that standard.
Interesting.
Yeah. You can probably see where we're going with this. That makes it tricky because the question is, okay, so what is the standard?
Right.
I'll give you an example that is from my own teenage years. My brother and I were about the same age. My brother liked to get into trouble. I was a people pleaser. I was a rule lover, so to speak. And one of my brother's favorite activities is that he and his friends would get together and terrorize the neighbor's cat. Put the cat in the dryer, or they would get a pillowcase and then shake up the cat in the pillowcase and then let it loose and see it get dizzy and walk down the road. And they thought that was incredibly hilarious.
Yeah.
But I'd always hear these things and I'm like, that's wrong. And then Andy would be like, there's nothing wrong with that. So the question is really, whose standard are we following? Because from case to case,
right.
Whose standard are we following?
Right.
Anger is also something that we do, like with our heart and our body and our emotions. Often we talk about anger as something that's happening to us or something that's inside of us. And it's not those things. Anger is something that we do. Here's another quote from David Powlison that I thought was interesting. He says, in Western culture, many theories of anger treat it as an emotional fluid that builds up pressure inside and must be released. A person's anger can be pent up or his pump is primed. People can be boiling mad or filled with anger or waiting to explode. They blow off steam, or old unresolved anger can be stored up inside or harbored for decades. If you get it off your chest so that your anger is spent, you feel better. All these metaphors depict anger as a pressurized substance inside of you. When people believe that anger is something inside of them, not something they do, it points to something other than repentance. This is the idea that we have of anger. People have either done something to us or it's something that's just inside of us that we can't control. That's just a wrong view of anger. Anger is an action that we do. And so I think it's good to get that correct right off at the start.
Do you think that anger always looks like what we think of as anger?
No, because I think that there's a godly form of anger that is completely foreign to what we understand anger to be. Because just think in your head about, okay, so when you think of the word anger, what comes to mind? Often we think about an out-of-control, irrational person
who's overturning a table.
Turning a table or going nuts to the grocery store or going off at a cashier.
Yelling in traffic.
Exactly. We think of the irrational person just doing mindless stuff, but God's anger is not that. And it's important to think about that as we go forward, because when we talk about God getting angry, God's not like an irrational person flipping over tables at Starbucks.
Right.
Or the guy flipping off people in traffic.
Right.
Or the person that's honking at every single person. Like we were stuck in traffic yesterday on the freeway coming back from Chattanooga, and like there was just this person that was honking. nobody was moving, but there was a person that was just honking, 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 honking.
Right.
Like, that's not God.
Right.
It's just so honked off that he's just going to act out and burst at everybody.
Right. Well, okay, so what is God's design for anger?
So God's design for anger really is a reaction to a violation of God's standards. Like when we see injustice, we react in an angry, indignant manner because we recognize that the world should be a certain way. And when it's not that way, when we see it broken as in a sinful way, then we get angry. A good example of that is like child abuse. Like we hear that a child has been abused and neglected by his parent. Like that story comes across in the 10 o'clock news that somebody left their child in a hot car without water for over an hour and the child was in distress. I mean, we get angry at that because it's mistreatment of a child. The problem comes when we're all sinful human beings and our moral compasses can just get completely off. Mm-hmm. That's almost like the core of outrage culture right now on social media.
Yeah.
That there's always some flavor of the week of some things that people are outraged about. And it's almost like manufactured controversy. An example of that would be the phenomenon of dead naming. Mm-hmm. Have you heard of this before?
Oh,
yeah. There's an example of like a student that recently graduated in Boonville that they put on the graduation diploma this kid's birth name. And I think legally they have to do that.
Right.
But the student identified as transgender and wanted to be called something else. And then there was all this outrage. It's like, why can't you put on this kid's diploma the name that he wants you to be? It's like, is this manufactured crisis? It's also like a big example of everybody has their own moral compass that's just completely different now. Mm-hmm. Everybody's outraged at something different. That can get very intimate in families.
Sure.
That's why there's a lot of tension within families, is that because of sin, all of our moral compasses are off ever so slightly. The tension point in my household is chewing ice.
Right.
My wife hates it when I chew ice. Mm-hmm. There's a standard for her that thou shalt not chew ice in the house. And when that standard is violated, there's a glaring response to me.
Thou shalt put the cap on thine toothpaste when thou art done.
Yeah, and I'm sure that I have some of my own things as well. Don't bother me when I'm doing this. I mean, whatever my standard is, we all have them. And when people violate our standards, we get angry.
Mm-hmm. It's like the guy you were talking about on the way home from Chattanooga that's just honking. It's like, there's no one that's specifically doing him wrong. He's just stuck in a traffic jam. It's just a thing that happens, but his standard has been violated, and he wants to make sure you know it.
Right, exactly. Everybody needs to know that my standard has been violated.
Well, can anger be good?
Yeah, I think anger can be good, and this is somewhat of a tricky question, but I have a quote from David Tripp, who wrote a book called Broken Down House. He said, "In a fallen world, people of character and conscience will always be angry." And I think that goes to, if we are godly people following God's ways and seeking out his kingdom, we will look at the world and see that it's not the way it's supposed to be. And then anger is a just response sometimes. And it can lead to positive action in the world. I think people who were abolitionists had an angry response to seeing slavery in the world and were Christians and made a difference in the world because of that response to what was going on in the world. So anger can be used by God for good when he gives us this tool to be able to see the world through his lens. And so we can have good positive effect on this world. I think the whole Roe v. Wade overturning has been great as well, that we look at this thing and Christians didn't just say, oh, well, when the Roe v. Wade ruling was made back in the 70s, they said, this is wrong and we need to do something to protect the lives of unborn children. And so it led to positive action in the world by Christians, which I think is great. The difficulty here is because we're sinful people, it's extremely difficult to be angry in a completely righteous way. Our anger emotions are always mixed up in a mixture between righteous anger and sinful anger.
Do you think it's possible to be bad angry for a good cause sometimes even?
Well, I think that anger is just dangerous because it can lead to bad actions sometimes. That the woman who's child has been murdered or molested. And then the reaction is to go out and to either slander somebody or to hit somebody or to take their aggression out on somebody else. I mean, just because something is justifiably wrong and a violation of God's standards doesn't mean we're always going to react in the right way.
Right.
But then there's always a mix of our emotions that are out there. And so it's difficult because there's always the presence of sin that's there.
Right. You just have me thinking, I don't know if there's an easy answer to this, but what ratio of our lives do we spend angry at injustice? Like, should we be pretty angry all the time because there is this thing, abortion, that's out there? Should we be angry at these injustices? Should that be a large part of a Christian's walk and their presence in the world?
I think it's easy to get in a position where anger can overwhelm your life, and I don't think that that's right either, because I think that you have to understand that God is sovereign as we are not, and there's certain things that are controllable or changeable, and there's certain things that we have little impact on, and we just have to pray and leave it up to God. I've met Christians before that are just completely angry with the way that the world is, and it's like they just can't accept it. Maybe that's not the right word. I don't know that it's right to accept it, but it's just they can't
just give it to God.
Give it to God, or let God be sovereign over the situation and accept the circumstances that a lot of times we have very little control over our circumstances and situations. And sometimes change is very slow. I've met Christians, back before Roe v. Wade was overturned, that would just come out and say things like, if we really prayed hard and did good work, then we could have Roe v. Wade overturned tomorrow. And why aren't we doing more for this? And like people that are just consumed by their whole life with that. Well, change is slow. Political action happens slow, and eventually it happen. But it's easy as a Christian to just get anger is very judicial.
Right.
Like we like to put ourselves in God mode, like in the place of God when we're angry. Suddenly we're dictating the world should be this way or the world should be that way. And really, we need to let God in his sovereignty take control of our circumstances. His ways are not our ways. His thoughts are not our thoughts. And I think we can be angry, but we can't let it consume our lives.
Yeah, I'm thinking about all the passages where people go up to Jesus and they're like, yay, come on, let's overthrow the Romans. This is going to be great. Time to usher in the new political dynasty. And he's just like, nah, that's not what I'm here for.
Not for me.
Not for me. Well, here is, I said this a lot on last episode, but I think this is it. Here's the $1 million question. How can I tell if I'm sinfully angry?
So let's differentiate between the two. So righteous anger is the type of anger perfectly expressed by God. So righteous anger seeks to glorify God, focuses on his kingdom, his rights, and his concerns. If we're glorifying God in the midst of it, using the character of God in those moments, that really is righteous anger. Righteous anger is going to mirror the characteristics of God that he wants in us, that spiritual fruit like patience, kindness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, wisdom, graciousness, forgiveness, those things.
Those things, yeah.
I've met some pastors that I really respect that have handled difficult circumstances in a godly way, and I appreciate that I think that there's a way that when there's a wolf in the middle of the flock,
right,
to handle that graciously as God would want you to do that. That doesn't mean those people that were pastors weren't angry. It's just they handled it in a manner in which God would. But then unrighteous anger is the type of anger imperfectly expressed by sinful people. Unrighteous anger seeks to glorify self, focuses on my kingdom, my rights, and my concerns. So unrighteous anger is a perversion and a parody of righteous anger. So it's like this carnival mirror of what anger really should be like. That we're impatient, we're mean-spirited, we're divisive, we're arbitrary, we're irrational, we're lacking in grace, we're lacking in forgiveness. And so if we don't have God's character in those times, and if we're not trying to push forward God's kingdom and God's standards, then we're not being righteous in our anger.
I'm a student of the great theologian, Mr. Rogers. I grew up with him, and he would always say things like punch a pillow. And I'm wondering if you think, is there an appropriate way for a Christian to vent that kind of anger, or is that more of a secular idea?
I think that's more of a secular idea. I love Mr. Rogers.
No, me too.
Just as much as anybody else.
But he wasn't perfect.
I mean, sweaters and cardigans are awesome.
Yes, sir.
But I think when it comes to anger, Jesus really talks about the heart.
Mm-hmm.
That out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. That the source of the fruit is really the root. And there's all sorts of biblical passages that affirm that anger always says that's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need to point back at ourselves and say, okay, so why am I getting angry right now? And be able to self-analyze ourselves to be able to say, okay, so is this something godly that I am being angry about? And if so, am I being angry with God's character? And sometimes that's a mix of things, but we have to always point the question back to ourselves. Okay, so why am I getting angry right now? And then how can I, in the character of God, with actions that he'd want me to take, do a positive thing with that anger to change society? We have the president of Indiana Right to Life, who is in our congregation. And I think that he's a great example and a great testimony. You can go back to listen to those podcasts on abortion that we did with Mike. And, part of his story is, he just saw the injustice in the world and wanted to do something about it. And he's using the character of the God and the methods that God would approve of to influence positive change in society, which is great. God's anger led to positive action. And that's a good thing.
So more on the negative side, what are some of the dangers of anger?
I think the first danger of anger is that anger can become what I call like a stepping stone sin. That anger, even righteous anger, can lead to other sins. Like the great verse here is Ephesians 4:26-27. It says, "Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down in your anger and give no opportunity for the devil." I think that's a really eye-opening verse, that if we are angry, there's an opportunity for other sins to be committed.
Right.
Or for temptation to enter.
Right.
Like, I think that's a time where the devil looks at the believer's life and says, maybe I can jump in on this. Mm-hmm. And there's an opportunity. The door is opened, and the devil's going to jump in and give us a temptation that's going to pull us in the wrong way. You see a child punch your child on the playground, and then you go and you yank that kid by the arm, you haul him over to his mom, and you cuss out both mom and the kid. Well, was your anger justifiable? Well, yeah, the kid shouldn't have punched your kid, but the action you took as a result of that was wrong. There's that moment where the devil stepped in and tempted you with something else, and you took the bait. Mm-hmm. And there's going to be lots of times in life where you could be justifiably angry about something, but maybe you should go and forgive and overlook that offense, because it's going to give an opportunity for the devil to step in and tempt you in another direction. I think another problem with anger that's huge is just interpersonal conflict. I mean, have you ever noticed that wherever angry people go, there's always drama?
Oh, yeah.
Interpersonal drama. And that's even in the Proverbs. Proverbs 15:18. A hot-tempered man stirs up strife, but he who is slow to anger quiets contention. There's always going to be this type of personal drama. Your life becomes a Kardashian show.
Right.
Or Proverbs 19:22. A man of wrath stirs up strife, and one given to anger causes much transgression. Mm-hmm. So it's those angry people that hold on to anger that are going to cause a lot of interpersonal drama.
Well, okay, here's another $1 million question. Does God get angry?
I think this is an interesting question. And I think we talked about this a little bit before, that we think of angry always in these
flying off the handle, drunken bar fight type of circumstances. And that's why we can't imagine an angry God, because we can't imagine. A lot of people don't like that song, Reckless Love. Mm-hmm. They're just like, God cannot be reckless. And this is the type of recklessness that people imagine with an angry God. Right.
He's just out smashing beer bottles and flipping tables and all the things that we talked about. But a holy God can display a holy anger. Like, he is jealous for his purposes, for himself and his kingdom, and justifiably so. And in his anger, he isn't going to do anything that is sinful. And he's going to have the character of God, that he's going to be patient, that he's going to be kind, that he's going to be loving in the midst of this. He's going to be self-controlled. And there's lots of verses where it talks about the anger of God, especially in the Old Testament. After the golden calf incident, Exodus 32, verse 10 through 11. Now then, let me alone, that my anger may burn against them, and I may destroy them, and I will make you a great nation. This is the line that he says to Moses, saying, I'm going to wipe these Israelites out, and we'll start over with you. Moses prays and talks to God. God relents of that disaster. In Numbers, there's kind of the summary of the Israelites' experience out in the wilderness, and it says, So the Lord's anger burned against Israel, and he made them wander in the wilderness for 40 years until the entire generation of those who had done evil in the sight of the Lord was destroyed. And then 2 Kings 17:18, the country is going into exile. And it says, So the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them from his sight. None was left except the tribe of Judah. And so it's very common for the Old Testament to talk about the anger of God. But you know what's cool about the anger of God in the Old Testament? The patience of God.
Right.
Is that God could have smoked out the Israelites a lot earlier than he did. He was very gracious with them. But I think that we want an angry God. So the anger of God means that God sees the fallenness of his creation and considers that fallenness to be wrong. So in this manner, it's good to have an angry God because he's showing his displeasure upon the evil things in the world. It's not as he created it to be. And God is saying that it's not okay for the world to be broken and his creation needs to be restored. That God is not indifferent to our suffering. I think people don't like the idea of an angry God because they like their sin too much. Usually the qualm is like, why does God get angry about homosexuality or sex before marriage or certain things like that? It's these things that, you know, if we created the world, this is the way that we would want it to be. But it's God's standards, and God can get angry at the violation of the standards that he created. And he's not going to do it in a capricious or awful manner. He's going to do it in a good, kindly, and just manner.
It is, in a weird way, it's a comfort to know that God is angry at some of the wickedness out there.
Yeah. What's the other option, right? Is that we have a God that's indifferent to everything.
Right.
That's not a comforting God at all. It's like, okay, do whatever you guys want.
No, not good. What is the connection between bitterness and anger?
Oh, I like this question because I think that this really exposes some things that I think that we are wrong about with anger. Great verse is Ephesians 4:31. It says, Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put aside from you along with all malice. I like to look at this verse, and I think a lot of other scholars and counselors look at this verse and they call it like the life cycle of anger. That most anger starts with bitterness. That bitterness is more of the internal feelings of ill will, that you harbor a resentment that's ongoing against some person or some circumstance. And I feel like often in the church, we're taught that it's okay to be bitter as long as you don't express that bitterness. As long as you don't actualize that, you can be as bitter as you want against anybody else. And I think the danger of that, based on this verse, is that bitter is like the root of that bush, and unless you dig it out, then it's just going to grow back or grow into something else. If you've ever done landscaping before, you know that you can't remove trees or bushes unless you remove the roots. Otherwise, they're just going to grow back. Usually, a pickup truck and a rope is a good solution for getting rid of bushes. And you have to do the same thing with bitterness and anger. If you don't get rid of the internal stuff, what's going on in your heart, then you're not going to get rid of the anger. You can, get rid of angry actions, but you're not going to get rid of the root cause. I had a friend that went to a counselor for anger issues that was not me, and it was a secular counselor, and he came back to me and he said, I had a great session with my counselor. He taught me this tip about anger, that he gave me a pattern to tap out on my leg whenever I felt angry to help me deal with my angry feelings. It's almost like the punching a pillow type thing. Well, the problem with that is that you can have all sorts of strategies to deal with the external stuff, but unless you deal with what's in your heart and the bitternesses that are in there, you're never going to get rid of anger. And that's what God calls us to do, is to take the holy pickup truck and to pull those out of the ground.
Why do you think that people become bitter? Like, why is it so hard to let go of anger sometimes?
I think it's the feeling of being wronged, even by our own personal standards. I mean, sometimes we know that it's not godly to be angry with somebody, but doggone it, we feel slighted anyway.
Right.
And we may not express it, and we keep it kind of buried down inside, but like, this is a great, like, teenager thing.
Right.
Like, our teenagers know it's wrong to be angry with so-and-so, but they're going to be bitter instead and harbor that resentment inside, even though they know it's wrong. But it's this whole philosophy that they've been taught. It's okay to hold resentment inside as long as you don't act upon it.
Right.
The problem with that is that out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. We don't say things for no reason. We don't do actions for no reason. Our mouths slip and our actions slip, and it's because of what we hold inside.
Right.
And it's like the drunk person. You know, I hate it when people say, when I drink, I become a different person. Well, no, you're the same person. It's just your conscience has been removed, and now you're laying bare what's already inside of you. And all of those moments happen for us on a daily basis. Some heat happens in our life, some suffering happens, or some difficult circumstance, or we don't get our way, or something difficult happens in our life, and what's already inside of us just comes spilling out.
Yes. I remember on my honeymoon, my wife took a piece of bacon off of my plate and ate it. And that was the moment when I realized I'm an angry person.
Bacon is my anger problem.
Yes, exactly. It was a trigger for sure.
You wouldn't like me when I'm angry.
So, returning to the question of God's anger, if Jesus was angry, is it therefore okay for us to be angry?
Oh, I love this question. This is often a line that people with anger problems will use with me, is to say, well, Jesus was angry, so it's okay for me to be angry. Or Jesus flipped tables, and so maybe it's okay for me to flip some tables too. I see some memes and some things that people post online too, that Christians need to be better table flippers, blah, 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 blah. It's usually just like a justification for our own anger.
Right.
So here's the problem. It's that the only person that was sinless that ever walked the face of the earth is Jesus.
Right.
We are not.
Right.
And we have to acknowledge that we are not Jesus. And so only Jesus could walk the earth and get angry in a perfect manner that is not going to lead to any sin. And we are not Jesus.
Right.
So we have to be very cautious with this whole thing. I usually say to people, well, if you can be sinless and perfectly righteous in your behavior, then you have the justification to be angry.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. But if you can't do that, you need to watch out because you're in trouble.
Right. Well, okay, so brass tacks time. What is the best way to deal with sinful anger?
Well, really, the problem with anger is either our standards or our methods. Like, our standards are not God's standards, or how we're going about things is not how God would go about.
Right.
And so the way that we deal with that is really to deal with the heart. Our job as Christians, as pastors, is not just to stop telling people to feel angry.
Right.
And it's never going to fix anything, because unless we change the heart, then we've achieved nothing. People need more than just coping mechanisms or punching pillows to deal with anger. Our job is to point out that our heart issues are the things that are causing our anger. Our anger is like the check engine light on the car, that if the check engine light is going off, you don't put duct tape over the check engine light and just say, okay, I'm going to ignore that for now. It means there's something wrong with the engine.
Right.
We need to figure out what's going on in the engine of our hearts, because we need to figure out the why behind our anger. And so we need to start asking some questions of ourselves. And maybe we need a counselor to come alongside of us, or a fellow Christian to come alongside of us and ask questions like, what was the situation? And how did you react to the situation? What were your motives? What did you want? What were the consequences? What does the Bible say is true about the situation? What did you fear? What did you hope? A lot of times when we ask those really hard questions, we realize that we're probably seeking or pursuing something that is not what God wants us to seek or pursue. And even if our anger is justified, then we're probably not using the methods that God would have us to use in order to solve that anger.
Right.
That we need to deal with grace and forgiveness. Allow God to be the judge and the one that metes out justice instead of us. I mean, it's easy to say that certain circumstances, we have the right to be biblically angry, and then people will use that to do all manner of evil things.
Right.
Well, no. We have to watch out for our behavior as well. So we've got to evaluate the heart and help people to see what's going on inside of them. If somebody's got an anger problem, I think that a good step is to talk to a friend or talk to a counselor. And I think a good book to go through is David Powlison, Good and Angry. Another good book is Uprooting Anger by Robert Jones, one of my professors. I think both of those are good starts. But anger is not something that comes from other people or other circumstances. Anger comes from us, and we've got to figure out why we are acting in such a broken manner.
Right. Any tips for that moment? My wife eats my bacon and I do have it well up in me, and I don't just want to punch a pillow for vent, and I certainly don't want to yell at her. Like, what do I tell myself in that moment? What do I do?
I think one of the key verses that I have in life is Proverbs says it is for God's glory that man overlooks an offense. One of the foundations of peacemaking and peacekeeping is that God is glorified when we don't get angry with people. And so when we just squash that and say, it's not worth starting a hullabaloo about this, I think our lives would be easier, but God would be glorified more in the midst of that. That's a piece of scripture that I often keep in mind, that it's not about managing my emotion. It's about saying that's not worth getting angry about. That's helpful sometimes.
Thanks for tuning in to the Northwoods Church Matters podcast. If you'd like to find out more about Northwoods Church, you can visit us at our website, www.northwoodschurch.org. Again, that's www.northwoodschurch.org.